Now, issue 20 on domestic violence. My main concern here is the lack of a preventive focus again. What does the state understand by public policy on domestic violence? What do you mean by that? Because the background that we have wouldn't lead us to understand the difference between domestic violence and the state response to that. Domestic violence is not just a crime or an offence which occurs under somebody's roof. What is the active state responsibility when it comes to preventing domestic violence? And this is where we come up against a problem of understanding here. The state has the responsibility to prevent domestic violence. There needs to be a criminal policy for prevention of domestic violence. You have an interesting law, good law, on prevention of domestic violence. And this law has many positive aspects, but we want to focus on ex post facto. Again, we're looking at reaction to the victims in the framework of domestic violence cases which arise and in prosecuting the victim. But what happens to prevent? What happens before that so that domestic violence, the acts of domestic violence can be prevented? The case of Jessica Gonzalez before the Inter-American Court. This is a very painful case, but it does show the distinction here. Jessica Gonzalez was a victim of domestic violence. The father of her children was not able to access the children. He had raped her. He'd taken away her children as part of this violence. He'd killed her children. He'd hidden them in the boot of the car, and there was a clash, and this father killed his children. How did he do that? He did that with a weapon which was bought under a supposed legal framework, when there should have been restrictions. There should be restrictions on the sale of weapons to persons who have already had convictions for domestic violence. So when I hear that there are some checks in place, or there are background checks in place on gun sales for persons or civilians, in the case of Jessica Gonzalez, these controls, the checks simply didn't work. The database failed. The state failed here to protect this person. There were calls to 911, and I'm talking about prevention again here. There were calls to 911, and nothing happened. There was no rapid reaction from the state. So the issue of responsibility, particularly in this situation of domestic violence, here we're talking about negligence here, because there wasn't a prevention policy in place. There's nothing being done to change behavior, to break down the cycles of violence. And this is something that I'm concerned about, and indeed the committee as a whole is concerned about. We want to ask what commitments the state is endeavoring to make to ensure that domestic violence will be dealt with a preventive policy, a clear preventive policy, as the Inter-American Commission has said in the case versus Brazil, which was the before and after of the state responsibility. Maria da Pena, this was the particular case. So it's not something that just pertains to the United States, it's something that's relevant in all countries, and the preventive policy needs to be put in place when it comes to domestic violence.
With respect to domestic violence, the United States has a strong commitment to prevent domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault and stalking, assist those who are victims, and hold accountable those who commit it. Protecting women from violence is a priority for the United States. President Obama appointed the first ever White House advisor on violence against women to work together with federal agencies to end violence against women. At the federal level, the U.S. Department of Justice's Office on Violence Against Women has awarded over $4.7 billion in grants and has launched a multifaceted approach to implementing the Violence Against Women Act, which is landmark federal legislation enacted in 1995 and strengthened in 2013. By forging state, local, and tribal partnerships among police, prosecutors, judges, victim advocates, healthcare providers, faith leaders, and others. Grant programs and authorized by the Act help provide victims with the protection and services they need to pursue safe and healthy lives, while simultaneously enabling communities to hold offenders accountable for their violence. The Civil Rights Division, in its agreements with the Police Department of New Orleans and many others, has provided guidance on how best to address domestic violence situations. During these agreements, we work with the state and local police departments to work closely with local victims' rights organizations to make sure we are getting this right. Currently in Missoula, Montana, we're working with campus police, local police, and have made it clear that the local prosecutor plays a role in what happens in the investigation and prosecution of sexual abuse cases.
Mr. Rodriguez-Recia asked about domestic violence and what are we doing in prevention area. In the state of Mississippi, through a federal grant from the federal government, and the state and federal governments work closely together, we are providing training in schools for prevention. We're doing it in English. You know, if you write a paper in English, then it can be on the topic of domestic violence or an art project and things of that nature. You know, domestic violence is learned behavior. It's not like that you have a gene that you're going to beat your wife. So the good thing that we have found about it is that by intervention with victims of domestic violence and children, that we can prevent many acts in the future. Now, your specific question about how the case, and I'm not sure if it was in California, where someone was previously convicted of domestic violence was able to legally purchase a gun. In Mississippi, as part of this grant that we have a protective order registry in the Attorney General's office in Mississippi, and we also have a registry of the conviction orders. And both of those are interfaced with our National Crime Information Center, plus it's interfaced with our NICS system. That's the system that you do background checks for guns. That case should have been caught if that state had that system. And the good thing about the grant system we use is that this model will be taken to other states, and other states will use what Mississippi has learned and implementing that. So we hope that that will decrease, and we've seen a significant decrease in Mississippi from 5th worst incidence of domestic homicide down in the nation, down to number 22 or 23 about 5 years ago.
And more particularly, what is being done to more effectively enforce the domestic violence offender gun ban legislation of 1996, to more effectively enforce the so-called Lautenberg Amendment. I'm raising the question because, according to information in front of us, enforcement is clearly insufficient. Very few cases that are at least known.
First, Mr. Kalin, with regard to your question on weapons legislation, the Obama administration remains committed to pushing for reasonable and common sense federal legislation, adopting measures designed to deal with small arms and light weapons abuse, including ensuring that there are background checks for all gun sales and to restoring the assault weapons ban. But beyond this legislation, the Obama administration has also taken a number of executive actions designed to protect life by ensuring that common sense measures are taking place with regard to weapons. And in November of this last year, 2013, the administration announced it had completed or had made progress, significant progress, on all 23 of the executive actions that it had proposed. In addition, Mr. Kalin, you asked about the Lautenberg Amendment regarding domestic violence and weapons. And in that context as well, the United States Department of Justice has, in July 2013, put out additional guidance, revised guidance in the U.S. Attorney's Resource Manual that instructs prosecutors how to approach that matter and try to ensure that that legislation, as well as all federal legislation involving weapons, is strictly enforced. I turn next to the questions that Mr. Shawnee and